Modern audiences experience an intellectual crisis because they are fed a fragile folk theology that views the Kaaba as a building protected by an automated supernatural force field. But history proves that these holy stones obey the exact same laws of thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and physics as any other matter on Earth. The safety of the haram is a legal and moral mandate binding upon human behavior, not a mechanical shield. Stripping away the medieval mythopoesis doesn't weaken Islam. It purifies our understanding of Tawhid by detaching the sacred from the idolatry of physical matter. Welcome to the Missing Dots.
It is genuinely so good to sit down with you today to talk about this.
Yeah, it really is. And I want to just invite anyone listening to sit with us for a while, just keep an open mind. Let's look at the actual history together.
Absolutely.
Because we are going way back to the year 64 AH. For those tracking the Gregorian calendar, that's 683 CE, the Siege of Mecca.
Right.
And we want to look at this through the lens of the earliest, most reliable Islamic chronicles, scholars like Al-Baladhuri and Al-Tabari.
Yeah, and we're also looking at modern architectural forensics and siege ballistics.
Which is fascinating. The goal here is to just look at these sources side by side and understand what actually happened physically and historically without that really heavy emotional overlay that usually comes with this story.
And that emotional overlay is incredibly thick. I mean, if you asked almost anyone today about the siege of 64 AH, the story you get is highly dramatic.
Oh, very dramatic.
Right. But when you actually consult the early lean accounts, the ones preserved by classical scholars, they describe something startlingly mundane.
Mundane in what way?
Well, the earliest layers of the historical record, before all the political editing of later centuries happened, show that the Kaaba catching fire was actually a tragic, localized accident.
Wait, an accident?
Yes. And crucially, it was an accident that started entirely within the defensive perimeter of Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr's own camp.
Wow, inside his own camp.
Exactly. Ibn al-Zubayr and his followers had basically entrenched themselves right in the courtyard of the sanctuary, the Mataf.
Okay, so they are physically camped out right next to the Kaaba.
Right there. And the most reliable reports detail that a defender just raised a torch or, perhaps they lit a small campfire for warmth.
Which makes sense. I mean, Mecca sits in a basin.
Yeah, the Hijazi climate produces these sudden, really turbulent crosswinds.
Right.
So a strong gust of wind simply caught a spark from that defender's fire and carried it straight onto the sanctuary's walls.
It is striking when you think about the methodology of historians like Ibn Kathir who preserved these details.
It really is.
They weren't just writing down every rumor they heard. They were looking at transmission chains, the isnad, to verify who actually saw this happen.
Exactly. They were rigorous.
And what they verified is something anyone who has spent time in a dry, windy valley understands completely. I mean, you light a small fire to keep warm, the wind shears off the hills, and instantly a stray ember is just carried away.
It's pure fluid dynamics.
Exactly. But what made the Qasas so vulnerable to that single spark? I mean, it's a stone building, right?
Well, it comes down to the materials used in its construction, and specifically its covering at the time. The kiswa back then was made of thick, layered, incredibly dry wool and silk.
Oh, wow. Dry wool.
Yeah, and some historical sources even indicate these coverings were occasionally oiled or perfumed with flammable substances.
Oh, so it's practically kindling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It obviously wasn't treated with modern fire retardants. So when that ember landed, combustion was practically instantaneous.
So the fire catches the textiles and the wind just drives it.
Yeah. But it didn't just burn the cloth. It actually destroyed the structural integrity of the stone walls themselves.
How does a fire destroy granite walls?
Because it spread vertically and aggressively. You have to remember the physical structure of the Kaaba at that point in history.
Okay.
Following the pre-Islamic reconstruction, the walls were not just solid, stacked granite. They utilized alternating courses of local Hijazi granite interspersed with wooden tie beams.
Right. I remember reading this. The sources mention that the timber was actually salvaged from a shipwreck off the coast of Jeddah.
Yes, exactly. So you have this dry, aged maritime wood integrated directly into the masonry to provide tensile strength.
Wow.
So the fire consumes the massive textile coverings on the outside, which generates temperatures that can easily exceed, 800 degrees Celsius in an enclosed space.
That is intensely hot.
It is, and that heat ignites those internal wooden beams.
Which creates a massive thermal shock to the stone itself.
Precisely. The Hijazi granite expands too quickly under that intense localized heat. The stones develop microfractures and they just begin to crack.
That is wild.
Yeah, as the wooden supports burn away to ash, the walls suffer total structural failure. And this exact same thermal stress, by the way, is what caused the black stone to split into 3 pieces during the fire.
Wait, really?
Yes, it was heat fracturing, not a projectile hitting it.
It's jarring because you and I, and probably everyone listening to this right now, grew up hearing a completely different narrative.
Oh, absolutely.
The famous story is that the Umayyad army intentionally bombarded the Kaaba with fire from catapults.
Right, that's the popular myth.
So if this was an internal accident, I mean, a literal spark from a campfire, why is the popular memory so convinced it was a deliberate demolition job?
To really understand the myth, we first have to look at the mechanical reality of 7th century warfare.
Okay.
The popular image assumes the Umayyad forces, who were commanded by Al-Husayn ibn Numayr, possessed precision artillery. People imagine something that could intentionally target a single building from hundreds of meters away.
Yeah, like a sniper rifle, but with boulders. But when I was looking through the siege ballistics for this era, you realize how inaccurate the technology really was.
Highly inaccurate.
They weren't using the massive counterweight trebuchets you see in movies about the Crusades. They were using traction trebuchets. I think they were called manjaniks.
Yes, manjaniks. And that is a vital distinction. A 7th century traction trebuchet was powered entirely by human muscle.
Right. You have to picture the physics here. You have teams of men, maybe 20, maybe 50 guys, all pulling simultaneously on ropes to swing the throwing arm and launch the wok. And because it relies entirely on human coordination, the variance is massive.
Right.
I mean, if one guy trips or half the team pulls a fraction of a second too late, the release angle changes completely.
Yep. The projectile lands 10 or 20 meters away from where you intended.
And then you must factor in the topography, right?
Right. The artillery was positioned high up on Mount Abu Quimes. They were firing downward at a really steep angle into a valley that we already established is notorious for unpredictable thermal updrafts and crosswinds.
So it's basically impossible to aim.
Completely. When you combine human-powered release mechanisms, a steep downward trajectory, and wind shear, the dispersion circle is massive. It is physically impossible that they could have targeted a specific 12 by 10 meter stone structure on purpose.
But wait, I have to challenge this perspective a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
If you are the Umayyad commander, you know the Kaaba is down there in the valley. Even if your weapons are highly inaccurate, firing heavy artillery indiscriminately into the sanctuary precinct is, well, it's massive reckless endangerment.
That's true.
How does that not cross the line into a direct attack on the sanctuary itself, even if it wasn't a precision strike?
That is a very fair question, and it requires us to separate the tragedy of the event from the intent behind it.
Okay.
There is a profound historical and legal distinction between collateral damage in an urban siege and a deliberate, godless attempt to erase a holy site. The Umayyad artillery was deployed strictly as an area suppression weapon.
Meaning they were just trying to blanket the zone to keep the enemy heads down?
Precisely. Remember, Ibn al-Zubayr had turned the courtyard, the mataf, into a fortified military trench.
Right.
You had hundreds of armed combatants stationed there. The Umayyads were firing into that general basin to pin those combatants down. They needed to prevent Zubayrid infantry from launching counterattacks up the hillsides to break the siege lines.
I see.
So it was a tactical military operation against an entrenched rebellion. It was not a theological mission to demolish a religious monument.
So the stones landing in the sanctuary were meant for the soldiers occupying the space, not the walls of the Kaaba. Which brings us to a fascinating psychological and political pivot.
Oh, this is the most interesting part.
If the Umayyads weren't trying to destroy the Kaaba, and the actual fire was an accident from a Zubayrid torch, how did the story get completely rewritten? I mean, how does an accident become state-sponsored sacrilege in the minds of the public?
It was a highly calculated piece of information warfare, and it originated with Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr himself.
Really?
Yes. After the fire burned itself out and the walls collapsed, he made a strategic decision. He refused to repair the Kaaba.
Wait, he just left the rubble sitting there in the middle of the sanctuary?
For months.
Yeah.
He had the resources and the manpower to clear the debris, to rebuild it, or at least to cover the damage out of respect. But he intentionally left the black and broken walls completely exposed for every pilgrim, merchant, and traveler to see.
Wow. It is brilliant in a very dark way. It's like a form of martyrdom signaling.
Yes.
Or like a scorched earth public relations policy. You weaponize the visual trauma of the building, because if you clean it up, the outrage fades.
Exactly.
But if you leave the blackened ruins there, you force every single person who enters the valley to look at this horrifying physical wound. You use that shock to recruit tribes who might otherwise stay neutral.
That is exactly the mechanism he utilized. He would literally stand in front of the scorched stones, weeping, pointing to the damage to mobilize sheer emotional outrage among the tribes of the Hijaz and Iraq.
SubhanAllah, just manipulating the optics.
Yes. He used the visual evidence of his own camp's tactical accident to completely delegitimize the Umayyads in Damascus. By pointing at the rubble, he effectively said, "Look at what they did to the house of God."
And the general public, seeing the rocks from the trebuchets in the courtyard and the burned walls, naturally connected the two events in their minds.
They did, and that localized propaganda was then actively subsidized and amplified decades later on a much grander scale.
Right, by the Abbasids.
Exactly. When the Abbasids violently overthrew the Umayyad dynasty in 132 AH, they faced a massive crisis of legitimacy. To justify their bloody revolution, they needed to portray the Umayyads not just as political rivals, but as structurally corrupt, godless tyrants who possess an active hatred for Islam.
So the Abbas essentially took Ibn al-Zubayr's original spin and codified it into the official state history.
Yes, they patronized scribes and historians to expand the narrative. Under Abbasid sponsorship, the numbers of the artillery were inflated. Highly dramatic literary flourishes were added to the texts. They cemented the myth that the Umayyads intentionally rained fire on the sanctuary. Turning a military accident into intentional sacrilege provided the perfect historical anchor to justify Abbasid rule.
But the truth didn't disappear. And this is what I find so compelling about the early Islamic historical tradition. We know about the campfire, we know about the wind. How did those details survive the Abbasid information machine?
The truth survived because of the rigorous methodology of Orthodox Islamic scholars. Men like Al-Dhahabi and Ibn Kathir acted as independent fact-checkers.
Right.
They applied an incredibly strict science of textual criticism to the transmission chains, the isnad.
They were essentially doing forensic history centuries before it was a recognized academic discipline.
Exactly. They actively sifted the lean, factual metadata from the highly emotional partisan storytelling of the Abbasid era. They looked at who was reporting what, whether those individuals were actually present in Mecca in 64 AH, and whether they had political motivations to lie.
That is incredible.
It is. Because of that rigor, they preserved the neutral truth, the torch, the wind, the dry wood, despite overwhelming political pressure to adopt the Abbasid narrative.
Which naturally leads us to look at the legal framework of this entire event, because if Ibn al-Zubayr was using the sanctuary courtyard as a military base, digging trenches in the Mataf, what does Islamic law actually say about that?
It's a complicated issue.
Right, because we are taught from a very young age that Mecca is a haram, a sanctuary where violence, hunting, and even cutting trees are strictly prohibited.
And that is true. The militarization of the sanctuary created the defining constitutional crisis of the era. The classical jurists debated this extensively under the framework of Siyar, which is Islamic public law and the law of nations.
Okay, so how do they view it?
Well, it is true that the haram possesses passive immunity. You cannot initiate hostilities there. However, the jurists had to address a complex reality. What happens when an armed rebel group, what they term Buqad, occupies that sanctuary and uses it as a fortress from which to wage war?
Oh. So by fortifying the space, they are the ones who alter its legal status.
Yes. The jurists recognize that a sovereign state has an inherent obligation to maintain public order, to protect the broader populace, and to suppress armed insurrection.
Right.
If rebels weaponize a sacred space, using its immunity as a shield while launching attacks, they legally compromise that passive immunity. The state is permitted to execute counterinsurgency operations to contain them.
So, from a strictly legal perspective, the Umayyads were acting under the mandate of state security. The collateral damage was horrific, but Ibn al-Zubayr bore immense legal responsibility for dragging the theater of war into the haram in the first place.
That is the consensus of the public law framework. The sanctuary cannot be allowed to become a permanent haven for armed insurgency without destroying the stability of the entire state.
I think that makes sense to people logically and legally, but theologically, it still leaves a lot of listeners feeling deeply uneasy.
I understand why.
Because our popular mindset regarding Mecca relies heavily on stories like Surah Al-Fil, the Year of the Elephant. God miraculously sends flocks of birds with stones to destroy Abraha's army before they can even touch the Kaaba.
Right, birds.
So a Muslim looks at the siege in 64 AH and naturally asks, well, why didn't God send the birds this time? Why allow the Kaaba to burn and the granite to crack and the black stone to split?
That tension is the very core of the intellectual crisis we mentioned at the start. People often confuse a specific, localized historical miracle with a permanent suspension of physics. The theology of Islam is actually deeply rooted in the concept of Sunan al-Kawn.
Sunan al-Kawn, the universal laws of nature.
Yes. The underlying principle is that God created the physical universe with consistent rules, and he generally expects the universe to operate according to those rules.
Right.
A structure made of dry wood and textiles will burn if an ember hits it, whether that building is a merchant's house in Damascus or the sacred sanctuary in Mecca. Granite will expand and fracture under intense heat. The wind will carry a spark.
Meaning God's sovereignty operates through the consistent physics of the natural world, rather than constantly interrupting it.
Precisely. Expecting God to act as an automated, supernatural kinetic shield for a physical structure is a deep misunderstanding of Islamic theology.
Wow.
The sanctuary is legally and morally.
If you think the stones themselves possess some magical invulnerability, you are bordering on material idolatry.
You are. And the Prophet Muhammad himself provided the definitive theological framework to protect Muslims from this exact misunderstanding.
What did he say?
There is an authentic hadith where the Prophet looked directly at the Kaaba and declared, "The destruction of the Kaaba stone by stone is lesser in the sight of Allah than the shedding of the blood of a single Muslim."
Just pausing to really hear that. The destruction of the Kaaba stone by stone is lesser in the sight of Allah than the shedding of the blood of a single Muslim.
It's powerful.
It is. When you truly internalize that, it shifts your entire worldview. Understanding the physical vulnerability of those stones actually protects our faith. It forces you to realize that the building is just stone and mortar.
It acts as a focal point, a direction for prayer, a profound symbol for unity. But it is not God. The true sacredness lies in Tawheed, worshiping the Creator alone, and in the sanctity of human life.
It is incredible how exploring the stark physical reality of the fire strips away the mythology but leaves you with something much stronger. When you remove the abased propaganda, the inflated trebuchet numbers, and the emotional mythopoesis, you are left with a raw, very human tragedy.
Yeah, very human.
But you are also left with a highly mature theology, a theology that does not shatter when you look at historical facts, because it places the sacred in the transcendent reality of God and the value of human life, not in the indestructible nature of earthly rocks.
That is the ultimate value of looking closely at these classical sources. They teach us that our faith does not require us to deny physics or history.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If the physical stones of our holiest site can crack, burn, and fall to ruin, yet Islam survives and thrives through the centuries, what does that tell us about where the true strength of this community actually lies? Perhaps the true sanctuary isn't made of granite, wood, or silk. Perhaps the true sanctuary is the community's commitment to justice, the preservation of human life, and upholding the rule of law.
That is beautifully said.
To rebuild your mental peace and legacy today, give charity, sponsor a student, and plant a tree. May Allah grant us success. Don't forget to pray. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.